It was a long and lonesome road, and the night never seemed to end. No matter how long I sat down to catch my breath, and no matter how long I walked, the dark just seemed to get darker. You lose all perception of time when you move forward and nothing seems to change. At some point, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a person standing on the road ahead of me. It vaguely resembled a woman dressed in a blue kaftan. I called out to her. I asked her who she was, where I was, and if she could help me. My throat was getting dry. I hadn't brought any water. I got no response and she just walked away. I followed. The forest opened into a clearing. An open space with log cabins, garden plots, apple trees, and a small jetty for fishing. The roofs were partially covered in solar panels, and there was a communal tool shed by the riverbank. There was a water pump at the edge of the clearing, so I figured the river water wasn't safe to drink. I could tell there had been a community of people living here at some point. Right now, however, there was no one around. I hurried over to the water pump and pumped it a few times. Having that ice-cold groundwater pour into my hands was beautiful enough to make me cry. I drank myself nauseous. Leaning against a birch tree to catch my breath, I noticed that the woman with the blue kaftan was gone. I was left there, among the cabins, on my own. All the cabins were open, 2 rooms each, 1 bedroom and 1 storage room. There was a communal kitchen in one of the cabins down by the river. I couldn't help but to imagine some sort of hippie collective living there, sharing stories by the campfire. I found a bed, complete with a blanket and a pillow. All I had to do was brush off a few stray May beetles. The next day I woke up with this awful headache, like something had moved inside my head. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the previous night, or maybe I caught something. I could still taste the ammonia from the previous day, where I lost both Evan and John to that thing. But having no one to talk to, there was no reason to put my experience into words. I was in survival mode. I decided to look through the place thoroughly. It became apparent that this was a collective once named St. Gull. At least 8 people used to live here, according to the number of beds available. It wasn't entirely clear what made them leave, but it must have happened soon and sudden. The woman with the blue kaftan was still nowhere to be seen. The place was stocked to the brim. Canned goods, fresh preserves, all kinds of dried meat. A shelf full of vacuum-sealed smoked fish. These people were self-sufficient. There might not be any plumbing, but there was a makeshift shower, provided you heat up some water beforehand. The solar panels were linked together into a series of batteries, all meant to power the kitchen. There was even a radio and a TV. Heating was done with wood furnaces. There was a well-used chopping block by one of the garden plots, bearing witness to many hours of diligent woodcutting. It took me the better part of the day just to get a good idea of what this place had to offer. By dinner time, I figured I could probably stay there for months on end if I wanted to. I might be able to ride out the entire Yearwalk right there at St. Gull. The apple trees were one thing, but the woods were covered in blackberries and wild plums. Hell, If I could figure out how to fish, I could stay there indefinitely. By dinner time, I dug out one of the many bags of rice from storage. I used some red cabbage preserves along with some salted fish. Some kind of lake sturgeon, I think. I seasoned it all with some rock salt and basil. I spoiled myself a bit. It made me think back to the time before I left my home in Maryland. I used to cook for my mom and stepdad 2 times a week, and I had ambitions to go to culinary school once. They just refused to let me do it, saying they wouldn't support my ambitions until I made a conscious effort to abandon my perverse life choices. Backwater fucking assholes. As I sat down by the jetty, watching the sun creep lower and lower, with a warm bowl of food in my hand, life didn't seem all that bad. I could get used to it. For the next few days, I just went into my own head, not talking to anyone, and having no contact with the outside world really puts things into perspective. Time becomes your own, and everything you do is all yours. There is no one to do anything for but yourself. No compromises and no excuses. I'm not sure I've ever felt so free. And honestly, after staying at Evan's place for weeks on end, I could use the space to stretch out. Still, thinking about John and Evan made my stomach sink. I tried not to imagine what they were going through. Were they stuck on the other side? Were they even alive? Still, even with all the comforts I could ask for, there was a certain hour at night where I could swear something was off. A cold shiver slithered up my spine, as if someone was looking for me. Considering what I'd seen these past few months, I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or cautious. It felt like the entire world was coming for me, albeit slowly. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. I'd sneak up to the windows to look outside, but there was nothing there, just a dark forest and a hooting owl. Still, there could be something there. Maybe I just couldn't sense the obvious. The lady with the blue kaftan was still nowhere to be seen. I started noticing little things changing during the day. Footsteps in the garden plots. The bucket near the water pump overturned. Nothing of consequence. But these little things that kept reminding me that I wasn't entirely alone. Someone was stalking the night. I decided I needed answers. The uncertainty would drive me mad either way. The calendar had crossed into early June when I found myself awake one night. I'd found a powerful flashlight and a hunting rifle. I planned to observe and find out what was skulking around at night, but I wanted some protection just in case. At the very least, I would see if I would need to protect myself. Hours passed and there was nothing. Not a peep. I started to think I was imagining things. Maybe the footsteps by the garden plot had always been there. I stepped outside to take a leak, bringing my rifle and flashlight along. After I finished my business, I took a short walk. A patrol, just to make sure I could sleep soundly. A faint breeze slipped through the birch trees. Dry branches creaked, playing tricks on my ears. But still, there was nothing. But as I turned back to the cabin, that shiver crept right back up my spine. Something was different. Had there always been a scarecrow in the garden plot? From afar, It just looked like a vaguely human pile of hay stuffed into a flannel shirt and an old pair of jeans. The more I thought about it, the more sure I was. This hadn't been there before. I'd met them before, these things hiding in plain sight, trying to pass off as everyday items. Still, it worried me. For each one you saw, there could be 30 more hiding somewhere. I raised my hunting rifle and took aim. "This won't end well," I said. "I know you're here." There was no response. I held my breath, trying to keep a steady aim. There was a slight flash of little blue eyes reflected in the cone of my flashlight. Then a snap. I turned around, dozens upon dozens of scarecrows lining the edge of the forest. There wasn't even enough ammunition to even attempt to take this fight. Something creaked, and as I turned around, the scarecrow in the garden plot was closer. They were back, and this time I didn't have Evan to protect me. I backed away, trying to look back and forth between the edge of the forest and the garden. An itchy trigger finger made the gun go off, blowing a hole in one of the scarecrows. There was no reaction, just a slow, silent pursuit. I backed out into the edge of the jetty. It was the only place where I could see them all. Looking at them seemed to make them stop, if only for a short while. Some sort of instinct. Still, every blink drew them closer. My breath grew shallow as my panicked mind tried to find a way to make the bullets last. Maybe I should save one for myself. With every blink, they changed. Some came closer, others changed shapes. Scarecrows, buckets, gardening tools. One of them looked like an old man in overalls, staring at me from afar. Maybe this had been the woman in the blue caftan. Maybe they lured me here. This might be the end of the line. As they took their first step into the jetty, I just started firing. It didn't help. With every shot, my ears rang, and every time I closed my eyes, they came one step closer. As my rifle gave out a helpless click, I realized there was nothing left to do. I could dive into the lake and make a break for it. That was all there was left to try. I turned around only to find myself face to face with the woman in the blue caftan. She was somewhere in her early 50s. She had this long black hair and deep green eyes. She was barefoot, but didn't have a speck of dirt on her. She didn't blink. I recoiled, shocked to have someone just appear out of seemingly nowhere. She hadn't been there earlier, and there was no way she could have climbed up onto the jetty. She was dry as salt, and I hadn't heard a thing. She held out a hand. "They won't harm you, you know," she said. "They can't." They can't? "They fear you," she said. "They can't harm you, not anymore." How? How would you know? I took her hand and she pulled me to my feet. "I can't tell a lie, dear." I turned around and there was nothing left. Just a few footsteps in the dirt from something that had tried to resemble a man in overalls. She led me back to my cabin, where we sat down at a small table. I was still feverishly clutching my hunting rifle. It didn't occur to me that I was out of danger. Maybe I wasn't. "Thank you for, helping me out," I said. What's Your name."
"That's not important right now,"
she said.
"but I'm curious. Who are you? And why have you come here?"
She was right, of course. Names weren't important. Not right now. You want the long version or the short version?
"I want whatever version you're willing to share."
We talked for hours. She seemed to know all about the creatures masquerading as items. She also knew about the many other things I shared with her. Everything from a world beyond our own to the church at the bottom of Frog Lake. This woman knew all about it. If anything, it seemed that she was the one looking to see what I knew, not the other way around. After explaining what finally led me to come to St. Gall, that cryptic suggestion to go north, she interrupted me.
"You seem to be a yearwalking then,"
she said.
"Willingly leaving the safety and numbers to pursue your ambition."
"I just sort of stumbled into it," I admitted. "It was my dad. I sighed. It all been this stupid, nonsensical gesture. Like, what I did could somehow bring us closer. Bring some kind of peace to him."
"It was a kind gesture,"
she said.
"but sometimes things don't go the way we planned. A slip of the tongue, a moment of weakness. That might be all it takes to send us spiraling into pain."
"You seem to know an awful lot about this," I said. "Do you know what happened to the people who lived here?" She thought about it for a while, looking out the window.
"A slip of the tongue,"
she said.
"That's all it takes."
We called it a night and agreed to talk in the morning. Strangely enough, I still had that feeling that something wasn't quite right. That shiver down my spine never went away, and I could feel my body tensing up. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen. She was making hard-boiled eggs. Strange. I thought, since there was no chickens around. No, wait. There'd always been chickens. I had the distinct memory of there always being chickens there, but I just hadn't interacted with them previously. But why wouldn't I? Odd. I didn't think about the eggs, I said as I entered the kitchen. I must have forgotten about the chickens.
"There have always been chickens at St. Gall,"
she said, wiping her nose. Well, I suppose so. You can't tell a lie, right? She just shook her head, without the hint of a smile. As we had our breakfast, she looked up from her plate. She had been silent for a few minutes, stuck in her own thoughts.
"I want to be clear,"
she said.
"When I say I can't tell a lie, I'm not exaggerating."
"What do you mean?"
"What I say is true, even if it shouldn't be. So when I say there are chickens, there are chickens. But maybe there shouldn't be."
I just blink, munching on my hard-boiled egg.
"I mean, it becomes true. And also, it has always been true,
she clarified.
which is why you might experience this sudden sense of disconnect.
I didn't even question it. At that point, I had seen and heard so many absurd things that this was just the cherry on top. To me, it sounded like a genie, able to grant wishes. Why weren't the blue-eyed things coming for her instead of me? Do you have to say it, or is it enough to think it? I asked.
Unclear, she sighed. So I try to do neither, which is why I keep to myself. Not much to spark thought when you're alone in the woods.
Yeah, I've noticed. I looked out the window. There was still a breeze coming through the birch trees.
I tried to just stay out of the way, she said. I don't want to trigger anything by accident. Not again. No slips of the tongue. No.
She leaned back in her chair with a glass of lemonade. She had this strange look about her, like she was having trouble keeping her thoughts in check. She looked worried. I used to have terrible nightmares, I said. I used to think there was something wrong with me. My mom kinda wanted me to think that, so I had these awful nightmares all through high school.
That sounds awful.
It was. I sighed. So whenever I feel like something I am is bad, I make a conscious effort to be kind to myself. Otherwise, I'm just punishing myself for something I can't control.
I see,
she nodded.
But what do you mean by nightmares?
She blinked and tilted her head. There was that feeling again. Like I was missing something. Like something had changed. You know, nightmares, I said. These images that come out of nowhere when you sleep.
You mean a dream? I've had those, she said. I've had plenty.
Like a dream, but horrible. Dark. She nodded, putting away her empty glass.
I'd like to try one sometime,
she said.
I don't scare easy anymore.
I spent the day trying to learn how to fish, trying to find a better toothbrush, and trying to fix a hole in my socks. My anonymous companion, on the other hand, spent most of the day inside the kitchen. She was trying out various preserves and just relishing in flavors, like she hadn't eaten in days. I made her a fish curry that night. A bit on the extravagant side, but I wanted to make a good impression. I tried not to think too much about what she said. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. All I knew was that there'd been chickens at St. Gull since the first day I got there, and I hadn't paid them much attention. It made sense, though. They had everything they needed without me. That night, as I lay down to sleep, my stomach kept turning. There was some part of me trying to keep me awake. Then a scream. A violent, unbridled screech. A woman emptying her lungs, tearing through her throat. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside. The woman in the blue caftan was sleeping in the cabin across from me. It must have been her. I flung open her cabin door. She just stood there in the middle of her bedroom. Her eyes had rolled back in her skull and her mouth was wide open at an impossible angle. She just kept screaming like there was no end to the air in her lungs, a cold sweat forming on her brow. She was having a nightmare. I blinked, and I was in a different place. An old house somewhere in the Canadian countryside. There'd never been a St. Gall. I'd come there looking for a friend, but all I'd found was horror. A house full of teeth, hiding like insects behind every nook and cranny. An awful wet smell, like the inside of a wooden mouth. A man with a face full of broken teeth looked up at me, on his knees, begging me to kill him. I raised a hammer and a metal bucket. I had to beat him into bloody pieces. Nothing could remain. Then another place, another truth. I was looking at a man sitting in a gas station bathroom, rust leaking out of his eyes and mouth as his phone died in his hands. Battery acid leaked onto the floor as his joints creaked like dying hinges. He couldn't stop coughing. He looked up at me with dying eyes for a moment. All I knew was that I had been there all along. "Warn them," he wheezed. "It won't stop." Another place, a green star illuminating a winter landscape. The angry dead coming to see who intruded on their homestead. A man shielding himself with a cast iron necklace. Then a swamp, an ancient gluttonous beast looking for their next meal, ungodly eyes looking at me with the intensity of a sun. In the distance, the death roar of once mighty lion. Little animals, twisted beyond recognition. Bunnies, frogs, even chickadees in the birch trees. Horror after horror after horror. Paradises of unspeakable cruelty. I was being pulled like a thread through the eye of a needle, all the while hearing the inhuman screech in the back of my mind. This was true. This was happening. It had happened, would happen, and was currently happening, even if it shouldn't. For a brief moment, I found myself back in the log cabin. I had teeth falling out of my pockets, and my shoes were wet from the swamp. Rust covered my fingertips. The woman with the blue caftan touched my shoulder, her screams turning into a soft cry. "You're here," she said. "You're not there. With them. Their place is not yours, and their horrors are their own." She hugged me, but it wasn't human arms. It was something else, something I couldn't perceive. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she cried. "I wanted to feel again." What? What did you... I had a nightmare. She stepped away, holding her head. She groaned, trying her best to stay in the moment. "I can't stop seeing them. I tried to make them go away, but it might just..." She stepped away as her eyes turned white. Blood started dripping from her ears, little drops plopping onto the wooden floor. "No, no, no, no," she groaned.
I can't stop seeing them. I can't. Wait, no!
Suddenly, I was floating in a river, gasping for air. I kept bumping against things in the dark. Faces, limbs, torsos, dead bodies floating, dragging me along. The air tasted sour, and the water stung my nose as a lukewarm gulp slipped into my lungs. Then an old house. A swarm of flies in the shape of a man, forgotten souls given wings and hidden away. He welcomes me as something sharp claws at my back. I turn around only to see somewhere new. A monstrous man steps out of a lake. A man with a melon-shaped head and a sinister grin. He chuckles. I'm at a cliff overlooking the New England coastline. I've lived there all my life. I am old, and my bones are weary. The woman in the blue caftan is there, her dark hair waving in the breeze.
I'm seeing things that have been,
she cried.
Have they always been? Are these creations my own? Or, please, Dad, please.
For a moment, I think she's talking to me. She reminds me of the daughter I always and never had. I take a step forward to comfort her, but she's not talking to me. A white feather brushes against my shoulder, and I felt that cold shiver run up my spine again. A blood-red eye in the sky, the size of God itself, parts the clouds. A rain of blood started forming in the skies above, staining more than the earth. She grabs me.
I'm sorry,
she cries.
We'll never meet again. Please remember me as a human woman in a blue caftan.
She wiped her nose as a bloody raindrop touched her cheek.
Yes, that's how I want you to remember me,
she continued. Then she pushed me off the cliff. I didn't have time to scream as my breath was pushed out of my lungs again.
You'll go far away,
she screamed.
Back to your truth.
Her face grew distant in the dark as I fell. Then pain. My body tumbled across a hard surface, as if shot from a cannon. I rested my face against warm concrete. It was a summer's night in late June. My body was nimble and my skin was soft. My hair had lost its gray. My own thoughts and experiences started to drown out the superimposed worlds I'd seen. All these visions remained, but as a distant, vivid memory. A living nightmare. I got up and brushed myself off. My ankle was sprained, and I was in the middle of nowhere. Somewhere. Further south, perhaps. I could already feel myself the simple comforts of St. Gall as I started walking down the long, winding road. I must have limped for hours when I finally heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. I stepped to the side, holding out a thumb. I promised myself not to be a hitchhiker, but I needed to at least know where the hell I was. Not once did I ask myself what kind of person was driving down this lonesome road in the middle of the night. The car stopped next to me. I could see a man and a young boy sitting up front, and every light on the dashboard was broken.